Through a deserted mountain road, amidst poisonous clouds, a caravan of steam transporters made its way. Such sights were common in these regions, for the peaks were destinations where golems stitched from scraps or beasts killers for the overlords of Barbarous were delivered. Often the cargoes contained tribute from the lowland inhabitants. Inside one of the rusted steam transports was a youth who, from childhood, had differed from his peers. But at that moment, he was merely living cargo, destined to be thrown into the torture catacombs. However, as fate would have it, the steam transporter fell into a ditch and overturned. Thus began the story of him who would be known as Typhus the Traveller, herald of Grandfather Nurgle and host of the Destroyer Hive. A master strategist, a deadly warrior, and a mighty sorcerer, as well as the most fearsome commander of the plague fleet of the Death Guard. His brethren harboured no doubt that Grandfather Nurgle favoured him especially. Yet at that time on Barbarous, few knew him as Callous Typhon. As a child, Callous Typhon was troubled by unusual phenomena. Objects would shudder and smash around him whenever he was frightened or angered, and plants would wither and die under his gaze. He believed controlling it was impossible, which alienated him from his peers. Some even spread rumours that the boy was a half-breed, his existence owed to the overlords of Barbarous, horrific entities that dwelled atop the mountains amidst the toxic clouds. By the time Typhon reached maturity, he had learned to master the psychic energies that resonated within him. It's hard to say what heights he reached in harnessing his potential by the time he first encountered his Primarch, but in that transporter, he must have been preparing for death, as he was being transported to slaughter, along with hordes of other lowlanders. When the stout youth, clad in rags, clambered out of the broken hatch, he immediately grabbed an oxygen mask, and from the accompanying transporters emerged sinister golems. However, the young man turned back to the opened hatch, wanting to help others escape. These men and women shared one common trait. They were resilient but panicked, for their physiology would not have allowed them to last long amongst the poisonous clouds at such an altitude. In search of shelter, the runaways headed towards the walls of the nearest citadel. They were so desperate to escape that the impregnable earth ramparts seemed less dangerous to them than the golems on their heels. The young man's gaze wandered over the tower until it rested on a tall, lean figure, observing them through the toxic mist. The observer would have sworn that a strange ripple in the air emanated from this daredevil, resembling the reflection of light off polished metal. Something glinted in the battle. In the next moment, the nearest golem was torn apart by giant earthworms, while the young man meanwhile drew a piece of metal from beneath his jacket and wielded it like a blade. At that moment, he sowed seeds of change in the observer's mind, for the youth not only overcame the golem, but also dared. "No," demanded the observer to help. His words, uttered through tears, were filled with confidence. "You, above, are you watching? You can help us." The tall, slender observer was none other than the young Mortarion. Hesitating not to assist the stranger at that moment, the latter would have been torn to pieces. The future Primarch intervened in the battle. He suspected this was another test from his adoptive father. Nevertheless, he drew his pistol and aided the survivors. In the heat of the battle, he initially failed to notice someone less resilient fighting beside him. A stranger in tatters fought fiercely, clutching a piece of metal, while his free hand emitted an oily glow. As this painful light spread, more and more toothed eels emerged from beneath the ground and seized the golems. Somehow, the youth had learned to control them, for the worms hunted only during the day. Yet what surprised Mortarion the most was that such a gift he had seen only among the overlords before. But there was no time to ponder. The battle raged around. Mortarion was splitting skulls, sluicing quivering bodies and trampling them into the mud, and the youth killed enemies with such fury that he momentarily lost touch with reality. Suddenly, a golem stunned the stranger with a club, and he dropped his makeshift dagger. Reaper saved him, and the battle paused for a while. When familiar alarm signals rang out, both understood that Nekare himself was coming to punish the rebels. Mortarion wanted to stand and fight, but his new ally dissuaded him. "They said you would help, and you did, though I didn't believe them." Mortarion never got an answer to whom the youth referred to by they. But he said he came to help simply because he was asked. Thus began the friendship of Callus Typhon and Primarch Mortarion. It is well known what it would lead to, but had Reaper been in the same time, he would have done exactly the same. Together, they fought for a long time. Once, Typhon's unit managed to capture many of the enemy's flying machines, in the holds of which was a lot of food. That day, people were allowed to eat their fill and not economize on anything. But the next day, the provisions were to be locked away in the city's collective storage and consumed according to established orders. Resources on Barbarous were scarce, and those who did not understand this could perish as easily as the unlucky ones caught by the overlords. Mortarion pondered the nature of such generosity. Apparently, Typhon tried to endear himself to the people in this way, because despite the battles and victories, the intolerance of Typhon's origins never completely faded from their minds. Too many, looking into the dark eyes of Callus, saw only the result of the union of a human woman and one of the overlords. Mortarion won his loyalty, despite non-human features and dark origins. And some would say that he had come the longest way. But for Typhon, his blood remained a heavy burden, and he understood that one day all overlords would be defeated, and he and Mortarion would have to find another reason to unite. Callus, in the depths of his soul, considered the Reaper a friend, yet secretly honed his gift, and also sought to awaken in Mortarion a sympathy for sorcery. One day he captured one of the overlords named Volcrol, and suggested contemplating what could be learned from this being. After all, they could summon deadly flames from beneath the earth, the poisonous fog, and storms capable of tearing into human consciousness itself. Possessing such power, they could more swiftly crush the last of the overlords and liberate the planet. For a moment, Mortarion heeded the request and pondered what he had heard. The incredible possibilities were hard to ignore. However, looking within himself, the Reaper saw only a part of the soul that would be betrayed and slain should he choose the path of his foster father. Typhon was disappointed when he heard the response that the Death Guard would never tread this path. He decided it was not yet time, but he did not desist from attempts to learn the source of the Overlord's power. "He doesn't know, does he?" The creature blurted out the question, desperate to stall for time. "That's why you silenced me. You were afraid of what I would tell him." "He is beginning to suspect, I think." Typhon considered the possibility. "Your words would only have confused the matter." Volcrol tried one last time to put on the air of arrogant superiority that was the creature's usual bearing. "I smell it on you, half-breed. The curdled stink of lesser meat fouling and diluting the strength of overlord potential." "Strength?" Typhon took Volcrol by the throat and applied a small amount of pressure. "Your kind are so brittle when one sees you up close. Stripped of your powers and your cantrips, you're nothing. I will know the source of your power, but perhaps not today." "Yes," Volcrol gave a manic chuckle. "It is already in you. The Octid, the gift of Nurgle coursing through your blood, I can sense it." Typhon recoiled from his words. "We are not the same." "Not yet," it said, "but great deeds await you in the future. Do you wish to destroy Nekere? I will help you. Release me, and I will give you knowledge. I will open all doors before you. And when the Supreme Overlord dies..." The creature glanced towards the passage through which Mortarion had left. "You will no longer need the Reaper. Barbarous and other worlds will be yours." Typhon lowered his head. "But Mortarion is my friend. I will not kill him." Volcrol saw the mistake it had made and hastily attempted to reframe its words. "I did not mean that—" "No, that's exactly what you meant," Typhon interrupted the conversation with a sweep of his dagger. He could not even contemplate betrayal, but he was unnerved by Volcrol's confidence in their commonality, and that Typhon's blood carried the blessing of the Plague Father. He remembered dreams that sometimes visited him in brief moments of mental rest, a garden of rot, dying and blooming, again and again. As a child, the mechanisms of decay had always fascinated him, and now, looking into the fathomless eyes of this twisted being, that old interest was rekindling. Volkrol's body collapsed amidst a welter of acrid blood, and it began to decompose instantaneously. The warrior crouched down to watch the phenomenon from close at hand, the spreading decay captivating every iota of his attention. Time passed. The campaign to liberate Barbarus was drawing to its logical conclusion. Of the overlords, only Nekare remained alive. It was then that the Emperor arrived on Barbarus, and Typhon was the only one who tried to dissuade the Reaper from his suicidal march on the fortress of the last enemy. However, he was unyielding and survived only due to the Emperor's intervention. When the Master of Mankind returned his lost son to the fold of the Imperium, Typhon was among those considered for ascension into the Astartes ranks. Soon, he had to learn quickly to suppress his potential, for after the Edict of Nicaea, the Legion renounced the use of Psycho's powers. Truth be told, Primarch Mortarion was initially disapproving of the use of librarians, since he saw in them a reminder of the terrible powers of the overlords of Barbarus, and believed that sorcery contradicted the martial creed of the Death Guard. Typhon once again put his faith in the strength of spirit and iron resilience, because these qualities had helped him master his abilities in his distant childhood. His body and spirit were so strong that Mortarion soon preferred Typhon over all others and elevated him to the rank of first captain of the Death Guard. Under his command, the First Company unofficially acquired the nickname Grave Warden, but over time this name became firmly attached to them and became known beyond the Legion. They were clad in Cataphractii pattern Terminator armor, which originally served as a prototype for the armor of later models. It allowed them to operate in extreme conditions of biochemical warfare and was equipped with devices for dispersing lethal substances such as the horrific creeping phosphex or the deadly Culgene gas. Where their squads went, enemies awaited a slow and agonizing death. An assault grenade launcher, a reliable short-range weapon that was primarily intended for use on Imperial Army vehicles, was often attached to their Terminator armor. The modified version on the Cataphract armor was a weapon that fired two types of ammunition: standard crack grenades and toxic projectiles with vapors of concentrated acid. When their ammunition ran out, power fists were used, which essentially were oversized, armored gloves that generated around themselves a force field capable of breaking the molecular bonds of any solid substance they touched. The Grave Warden armor was also equipped with protective mechanisms that allowed a Terminator to envelop themselves in a deadly toxic mist, which could be used both as a means of camouflage and as a final argument. As the errant worlds of the galaxy were brought to Imperial compliance, Typhon distinguished himself time and again. He ascended first to the rank of a knight, and thereafter to a warrior king, significantly contributing to the triumphs of his legion during the Great Crusade. The capacity of Typhon to remain impervious to the malefic impacts of adversarial war zones and the weaponry of foes alike turned into a legend frequently recounted. In the tribe wars on Rothric 9, Typhon found himself disarmed and received a mace strike to the side of his head that would have slain any lesser man. Instead, it propelled Typhon into a frigid fury that resulted in the demise of every tribal warrior in the vicinity, armed with nothing more than a short iron bar. He selflessly protected the lives of a squad of Sisters of Silence on Madrigal by diving onto a malfunctioning crack grenade. Following less than a solar week in the Legion's Apothecarian, he discharged himself, ready for active duty anew. Even the Brotherhood of the Death Shroud, the 49 hand-selected warriors serving as Mortarion's elite honor guard, stood in awe of Typhon's extraordinary resilience. Though unspoken, the warriors of the Death Guard followed Typhon, motivated by a combined sentiment of fear and respect. Yet, despite his devotion to the cause of the Death Guard and the Imperial truth, callous Typhon aspired for something greater. He contemplated that if he could achieve such heights without the utilization of hidden powers, what greater heights could he reach by embracing them? The foremost chaplain of the Word-Bearers, Erebus, initiated Typhon into the mysteries of the Seven-Pillared Lodge, one of the warrior lodges that had started to proliferate throughout the Space Marine legions in the twilight of the Great Crusade. The first captain realized the heights Astartes could achieve if they shed the shackles of the Emperor's misconceptions. Since the Primarch and his first captain sided with Horus in his insurrection, They rapidly disseminated rebellious thoughts within the Legion. Nathaniel Garrow, the 7th Great Company's battle captain, stood as the most notable exception, whose refusal to let the honor of his legion perish altered the trajectory of the entire Horus heresy. The corruption that had begun to pervade the Legiones Astartes would climax at Istvan III. Following Horus's orders, the Death Guard purged those who wished to remain loyal to the Emperor. Mortarion hoped to sway Garrow and thus chose to spare him from retribution. Typhon, however, viewed this as a misjudgment, and while strictly adhering to the Primarch's commands, ensured that Ignatius Grulgor, Garrow's adversary within the Legion, was assigned to the same vessel. Grulgor, having readily sworn allegiance to Horus's banner, was keen on murdering Garrow. Nevertheless, the traitorous scheme was unveiled, and Grulgor perished in the conflict that ensued. Garrow was resolute in fleeing the Istvan system to head for Terra. Realizing something was amiss, First Captain Typhon, aboard the massive Death Guard battleship Terminus Est, moved to intercept the small frigate when he had received no word from his usually boisterous subordinate Commander Grulgor. He gave chase as the Eisenstein attempted to evade the guns of his ship. The frigate sustained severe damage from the Terminus Est's massive gun batteries as it sped past. Garrow and a handful of fellow Death Guard legionaries managed to escape, taking word of Horus's rebellion to Terra. Driven by a desire to discern his place in the galaxy, Callus Typhon alongside the Grave Warden soon broke away from the Legion. Their wanderings led them to the planet Zaramund, where Luther of the Dark Angels provided him with a small repair camp for restoring the Death Guard ships. But Typhon sought not this. He was in search of answers, though he could not even formulate the questions. For many hours the first captain roamed the camp, unsure of his destination. Focus was hard to come by. More and more frequently the Death Guard felt as if he was drifting with the current, that on the outskirts of his consciousness, the cold hum of something dark echoed when his mind should have been at rest. Something barely perceptible drew him, like a magnet, especially when Callus was aboard the Terminus Est, and even more so when the ship sailed through the warp, as if a melody audible only to him or an echo of a voice from another world resounded. With each passing day, he felt less like the warrior he was accustomed to being, and more like a stranger, the traveller, hiding deep within himself. He thought of the dawn he had witnessed, the subsequent divergence of light and shadow. Typhon felt the same transformation within him, which would become noticeable only if he stopped resisting and allowed it to happen. But what then? Typhon led his flotilla away from the shadow of the Primarch because he believed that he was to fulfill his own destiny, as he always did, even when he was a youth. Even before Mortarion's father came for him. But now, as the outlines of a predestined path manifested, he no longer knew where the road would take him. The answer came in the form of a crowd of pilgrims that appeared at the camp's gates. As he spoke with them, one of the Dark Angels suddenly attacked them and then engaged in combat with the first captain. Seizing the right moment, the Dark Angel plunged the blade into Typhon's body, but it instantly rusted and crumbled away, while from the wound flowed blood black as tar. But before this, the first captain managed to see what was intended for his eyes, and hear what was intended for his ears. Out of the crowd of pilgrims, an old woman came forward, showing him the same marks on her body that he had. These same dull, yellowing boils, in the shape of the unholy triangle of grandfather, adorned the bodies of other travellers, on their neck or chest. And now Typhon felt his kinship with them. He noticed clusters of black flies everywhere, after which the woman approached him and touched the boil, tracing with her fingers lines depicting 3 intersecting circles. Typhon found himself perplexed. Even in his childhood he had felt that great beings moved beyond the boundary of his perception, as if he saw the waves raised by invisible leviathans swimming beneath the surface of the ocean. The first captain never doubted that these entities had influenced his life, but never before had he encountered others who also felt their touch. Even Erebus, with all his speeches and omens, did not seem as close as these strangers. For a moment a veil fell from his eyes, and he saw the true essence of the inhabitants of Zaramund. Death was their destined fate, yet they were frozen halfway there because of the same diseases that doomed them. Later, aboard the Terminus Est, He reminisced about the title with which pilgrims had referred to him. Herald, the one who bears the truth about the harsh reality. And now, Typhon fully acknowledged this truth. He remained of the Death Guard, as always, dead yet living, but tireless, existing between the tumult of life and the cold embrace of the grave. Others might see a contradiction in this, but not him, not now. He convened his grave warden and shared with them 7 ceremonial cups, adding a drop of his cursed blood to the drink. Then he ordered a course to be set towards the main fleet to reunite with the Death Guard. The journey of the splintered flotilla was coming to an end. For the warriors of Callous Typhon, this was a routine raid on a distant planet, but for him, it was a rebirth. For there, on the surface, a true exocytosis took place. His hidden essence emerged outward through the wound inflicted by the Dark Angel. Watching his brothers drain the chalices, the first captain recalled the name the pilgrims had called him, Typhus. After reuniting with Mortarion, a pivotal moment in the Legion's destiny occurred. On the way to Terra, the fleet transitioned into the warp, where Typhon eliminated the fleet's astropaths, accusing them of conspiracy against the Primarch. Then he assured Mortarion that he could navigate the fleet through the Imperium himself. However, they got lost and found themselves in the domains of Grandfather Nurgle. A horrific epidemic swept through the entire fleet. Before long, fat devil flies buzzed through the thickening miasma inside each warship. Where they bit at the desperate warriors trapped within, flesh turned to suppurating jelly. The demon venom of their stings caused mortal flesh to blossom into hard new growths. Bellies distended and eyes ran like cracked eggs. Even power armor melded and flowed into strange new shapes. Here, the superhuman resilience of the Death Guard to disease and toxins proved to be their enemy, for they could not simply die, nor were they permitted to do so by the Plague Lord. Instead, they were slowly, sickeningly transformed into Plague Marines, for whom there was nothing more terrifying than watching the plague render their legendary resilience meaningless. Pestilence swept through the entire fleet, festering in their guts and bloating their superhuman bodies. They were corrupted from within, and it was nauseating to look at them from the outside. With each passing minute their condition worsened. Their incredible transhuman physiology became their greatest enemy. What they endured was unimaginable, and none suffered more than Mortarion. Did he realize in those terrible hours the loss of everything he fought for? Or did he comprehend the curse he had brought upon himself and his legion? Alas, it remains unknown. Mortarion refused to believe until the end that his old friend had betrayed him, despite his disdain for him as a psyker. Eventually, he even released the demon Grulgor, who became a life-eater, because he swore to serve him and destroy the first captain. However, when they battled, it was revealed that Grulgor had long before pledged allegiance to Nurgle, and no other vow was stronger than that. At the climactic moment, the first Captain Typhon absorbed an entire swarm of demonic flies and was reborn. His back swelled under the crack of breaking bones and ceramite plates. From the openings, clouds of flies burst forth, followed by enormous horns. He shook off his dead grey flesh to reveal rotting muscles, and the places where armor fused with flesh ceased to be distinguishable. With a revolting crunch of breaking cartilage, a massive horn grew from his forehead. His essence hung somewhere between life and death. Callous Typhon was reborn as the immortal Typhus, herald of plague and destruction, the incarnate ideal of the Death Guard, indomitable and steadfast. Thus ended their friendship. One remained true to himself, a bearer of truths he arrived at independently, rising to become a champion of Nurgle, while the other fell prey to the plague god. Black, all-consuming despair touched Mortarion's soul, and he remembered the moment he died at the feet of Necare. But now there was no emperor to save him. He saw what could have been the face of a god, an image of 3 unblinking eyes forming an unholy triangle. Then the realization dawned on the Primarch that this truth had been waiting for the right moment for an eternity. Mortarion pledged his loyalty to Grandfather Nurgle and was reborn, and with him the entire Legion was reborn. The ship Terminus Est, also underwent changes. Once it was a mighty battleship created during the Great Crusade. It remained the most powerful battleship of the Death Guard fleet, and it was its guns that destroyed the Raven Guard's Shadow of the Emperor during the battle at Istvan V. Previously, its guns had attempted to shoot down the frigate Eisenstein to prevent Nathaniel Garrow from escaping. Now, this once proud ship resembled a huge, diseased leviathan, covered in filth and twisted beyond recognition by biomechanical growths and pustules. To this day, the image of Terminus Est is considered the most repugnant among the cursed ships of the Death Guard. If not for the pulsating magic in its ancient heart, it would have long since crumbled. Its spine, a perfect specimen of corrosion, and its hull, a poisonous mix of dissolved heavy metals and boiling plague broth. Its true dimensions are practically impossible to ascertain due to the swarm of demon flies that envelops it from all sides. Over the centuries, this swarm has come to serve as something akin to a Geller field for the Terminus Est, readily consuming any unwelcome guest daring to approach too closely. The arrival of the Death Guard in the Sol system before the Siege of Terra resembled the opening of a festering wound, for what emerged from the warp was no longer the 14th Legion. They were bestowed the honor of being the first to land on the surface of the cradle of humanity, followed by the World Eaters. Typhus aided Zardulayak in summoning the demon Korbaks to the Outer Palace to dismantle the imperial cult of Euphrati Kila and to weaken the defences of the Imperial Palace. Subsequently, he received orders to capture the Astronomicon, but merely shifted his forces slightly, as the Reaper engaged in combat with Jagatai Khan. Many understood that a rift was brewing among the renegade ranks. Thus, each legion sought to secure advantageous positions in case of a backstab. Typhus awaited the defeat of the Primarch to remain the sole commander of the Death Guard on Terra. Eventually, Mortarion was exiled to the Warp, while the White Scars successfully dealt with the remaining Death Guard at Lion's Gate. After the War Master's defeat, the renegades retreated into the Eye of Terror, where Mortarion made a plague planet the Legion's home, reminiscent of Barbarous, with the Reaper ruling over demons and Chaos Space Marines. However, such sentimentality was foreign to Typhus. He considered Nurgle, not Mortarion, to be his true master and father. Thus he was not satisfied with being merely a right hand to the Primarch. Instead, he gathered those whose hatred for the Imperium still burned fiercely, and formed his own plague fleet, led by the Terminus Est, a rotting spear he intended to thrust deep into the heart of the Imperium. With the blessing of the Plague Father, he inflicted many wounds upon humanity that will never heal, bringing forth hundreds of thousands of diseases without cure. Typhus's ambitions never left him, and his relentless search for the perfect plague led to the annihilation of nations, worlds, and even star systems. Rumors abound that Typhus followed a humanoid emissary, entirely composed of his own demon flies, and arrived at Nurgle's garden. When the legionaries of Khorne invaded the garden, it was Typhus who coordinated the defense of Grandfather's holdings and led the final attack of buzzing plague drones and similar slime creatures in the bubbling chasm. At the battle's climax, he overcame a gigantic demon prince leading the legions of Khorne and took his guts as a gift for Nurgle's cauldron. As a result, he earned a high accolade directly from the Grandfather, being allowed to approach the throne of the Plague Father and dip his scythe's blade into the filth accumulated nearby. Such tales are passed down wherever Typhus treads, signalling the growing ambitions of the Herald of Nurgle. The few fortunate enough to survive an encounter with Typhus have managed to describe his equipment. From the times of the Great Crusade and the Horus Heresy, he has donned Cataphractiae pattern Terminator armor. Already on Zaramund, he realized that the armor was fusing with his body and accepted this. Now, however, the armor has been altered by the influence of the warp, becoming his second skin and transformed into a dwelling for the destructive swarm. Fused chimneys of bone sprout from his torso, and in the thick of battle these tubes belch out great clouds of demonic flies. The grotesque demonic flies that infest the Destroyer Hive are truly disgusting creatures, though in the eyes of Typhus, as well as of Father Nurgle himself, each is a diminutive angel of decay, just waiting to pass on the blessings of rot and entropy to all they touch. Previously, Callous Typhon wielded a hand flamer attached to his power scythe. Now his scythe, named Man Reaper, is such a deadly weapon that even its stench can deprive a mortal of strength. Though Typhus has never confirmed the rumours that he dipped his weapon in Nurgle's own brew of filth at his manse in the Garden of Nurgle, any mortal being that is touched by its blade quickly collapses into a pile of festering bone. Wind of Chaos. Typhus is a Death Guard sorcerer who can call forth the corruption from within his soul, unleashing waves of psychic energy that are subtly different for each sorcerer. A sheet of iridescent warp fire for the followers of Tzeentch, a golden cloud of rapturous agony, or a rain of hypnotic light for the worshippers of Slaanesh, and a stream of bilious filth for those devoted to Nurgle like Typhus. Another element of the equipment of the Herald of Nurgle includes grenades. In the past, as a glorious soldier of the Great Crusade, Callous Typhon used rad grenades, which exploded in a rain of tiny radioactive shards and struck enemies with debilitating radiation sickness. Now, however, he uses blight grenades. Like many artifacts of chaos, the origin of such grenades is shrouded in the darkest of legends. Nurgle, as is known even to the most novice of demonic lore, is the plague father and of various contagions. Desiring to know how infectious each of his creations is, he assigns his legions to keep account of the infected. Up to a certain point, the plague-bearers and other carriers of Grandfather's blessings could keep these staggeringly large numbers in their heads. But over time, they required mechanisms for counting and began to construct massive abacuses from rusted iron poles and the wrinkled heads of their victims. Each abacus contains many thousands of horrific beads, each filled with larvae, fetid fluids, and other poisonous gifts of Nurgle. These heads could remain in their places forever, clacking against the metal poles when moved by the accountants. But the great unclean ones could not bear that such delightful gifts go to waste, and often sent little Nurglings to steal heads from the abacuses. Not all such raids were successful, and all too frequently the petty thief was found caught and impaled, muttering in disgust next to the very prize he thought to steal. However, should the creature succeed in its mission, the great unclean one rewarded it with a delectable piece of rotting flesh. And if the shriveled head contained particularly intriguing sores, the great unclean one sometimes preserved it for study. Yet more often than not, the great unclean one quickly lost interest, adding the stolen head to his pile of trinkets from which he selected gifts for particularly obnoxious mortals. History states that blinding grenades first appeared after the occasion when the great unclean one Kugath presented a whole 3 accounts to the Legion of the Death Guard. Such gifts had been given before, but never in such quantity. Indeed, few are aware of the true origin of these plague-ridden heads. Should a worthy warrior survive the act of being presented the gift, he merely perceives it as a weapon to be hurled at the enemy, reveling in the flies, larvae, and poisonous vapours that burst forth upon detonation. It is no wonder that such a mighty warrior as Typhus could receive such gifts and employ them. As star systems were destroyed in the material world, he became ever more convinced of his unique destiny as a true son of Nurgle. And Mortarion was increasingly deemed as a weak warrior, incapable of waging a prolonged war against the Imperium. It is said that in periods of inactivity, Typhus silently presides over the command throne of Terminus Est. His mind merges with the sensations of the mighty ship, seeking the next target for attack among the warp's worlds. His relentless search for even more places to spread the blessings of Nurgle earned him a half-respectful, half-mocking nickname, the Traveller. Such is how the servants of other gods call him. Throughout the Black Crusades, which lasted from the 31st to the 41st millennium, Typhus, the Traveller, eagerly assisted Abaddon the Despoiler, unlike Mortarion, and never missed an opportunity to exploit attacks on the Cadian Gate to spread the seeds of the zombie plague everywhere. Typhus has been tireless in his prosecution of his true master's goals. He unleashed Nurgle's rot upon Carandinis 7 and Protheus, turning billions of ailing souls into plague-bearers that tirelessly catalogued the lesser diseases springing up in Typhus's wake. On Ligeta, he loosed a plague song that forced the infected to chant a hymn to Nurgle, even as they slowly wasted away. He wiped out the entire male population of Florins with the dreaded red flux, and engineered the Jonah's World pandemic, reducing a once proud shrine world to a global necropolis of rot-filled tombs. Yet the crowning glory of Typhus's achievements is the introduction of the zombie plague into the segmentum obscurus. With this terrible new curse, Typhus has fused the cycles of life and death together, an act that has pleased his master greatly. In the year 757 of the 41st millennium, the Hydra Minoris outbreak marked the first occurrence of the zombie plague, following Typhus and his Death Guard legion's devastating incursion into the heart of the capital hive city on Hydra Minoris. As the populace succumbed to the agonizing malady, its true abomination was unveiled. The deceased victims commenced their reanimation, embarking on a relentless assault against the living. An imperial decree of quarantine ensued, entrapping 23 billion non-infected citizens in an unrelenting nightmare alongside an ever-increasing legion of the undead. In the year 926 of the 41st millennium, a Chaos space marine known as the Purge selected the strategically vital astropathic hub and fortress planet Vaxhalia for its malevolent intention. Within a single solar month, they executed the annihilation of no fewer than 14 billion civilians. Yet, this villainy did not remain unnoticed for long. The Hammers of Dawn, Firelords and Crimson Fists chapters orchestrated a planetary assault bolstered by the support of a dozen guard battle groups and a few knights from House Raven for added measure. Subsequently, Vaxhalia was transformed into a tumultuous cauldron of warfare, attracting forces from across the sector. However, matters escalated further when the vessel Terminus Est made its ominous appearance in orbit, deploying hundreds of plague marines onto the planetary surface. Typhus the Traveler led the renewed onslaught, and with each passing day, an increasing number of inhabitants fell victim to the zombie plague. Before long, the Astartes and Knights found themselves embattled against a tide of traitors and the walking dead, fighting alone. Upon the arrival of the Second Imperial Fleet, its commander deemed the world irretrievably lost and commenced preparations for the evacuation of survivors and the initiation of exterminatus. Before the onset of the Plague Wars, the Death Guard had seized a series of worlds within the bounds of Ultramar, known thereafter as the Scourge Stars, under the plague-ridden command of Grand Marshal Mortarian's finest, Typhus the Traveller, and the two great unclean ones, Kugath and Slurg Glottothrax. However, during the assault on Ultramar, Typhus heeded no command from the Primarch, deeming him unworthy and regarding himself as the true favourite of Grandfather Nurgle. Thus, he did not join Mortarion on Espandor or Parmenio, but ultimately led an attack on the planet Dessar. The forces of the Death Guard he commanded advanced into the very maw of fire, monotonously intoning blasphemous hymns. They fired their corroded deadly bolters while on the move, their projectiles extracting lives from the bodies of the defending loyalists. Typhus's psychic potential was higher than ever, and with his inner gaze he witnessed the souls of the fallen departing their bodies and rushing into the warp streams. Yet they did so all too swiftly. At that moment, he lamented the wasteful expenditure of flesh, for he had always preferred despair over bolters and blades, finding it exquisitely delightful. The total forfeiture of hope was Typhus's favoured wine, a flavour only surpassed by encountering the few individuals who possessed the resilience to survive, witness the truth, and convert to the worship of Grandfather Nurgle. Yet he decided to indulge his desires at another time, preferring instead to secure victory in that battle. Typhus fought at the forefront. There is nothing good when the chief follower of Nurgle keeps to the rear ranks. Mortals needed to see the power bestowed upon him, so they could realize how little their false god had given them. They needed to behold the glory of Typhus, for only then could they forsake hope and embrace the arms of Grandfather Nurgle. Typhus wielded his cursed scythe on the battlefield, the weapon hissing through the air, leaving behind a trail of blue sparks. Everything it encountered was destroyed by a mighty blow from the disintegrating fields. Then an exalted herald of Nurgle, Lord Molokos, appeared before him and ordered to cease the hostility with Mortarion and head to Parmenio to attack the star fortress Galatan. Reluctantly, Typhus obeyed and replied that he would take Galatan so that Mortarion would choke on the glory of his victory, then ordered his forces to retreat. When the plague fleet approached Parmenio, the battle commenced. Galatan was blessed with dozens of shield banks. Deep within its armoured shell, thousands of serfs laboured under the stern oversight of the tech adepts. Choirs sang hosannas to the glory of the machine, while labouring gangs ejected spent shield capacitors and replaced them with fresh ones brought on squealing rails from armoured storehouses. Each was the size of a small gunship and required the muscle power of hundreds of men to switch. They heaved, rolling the devices from their transports and slamming them into cavernous sockets. Weapon fire was freely exchanged between the fleet and the battleship. The moans of the damned penetrated the fortress's voxnet until the communications overloaded and the loyalists shut it down and transferred all communications to hard wires. It made no difference. An unholy meld of sorcery and science projected the screams. Simultaneously, the noosphere of Galatan was subjected to assault by sorcerous code. It came streaming in on pulse broadcasts of warp-infused electromagnetic waves. Deep within the neverspace of cogitator banks and serial-linked servitor mines, Magi waged an informational war against demonic attack. The machine spirits of Galatan found themselves besieged before its human defenders had to raise their laser guns. Again, the lightning batteries and warp lances of the plague fleet struck. Again, their unclean magics raked at the void shields of one specific spot, stripping layers back until but one shielding matrix remained intact. The shells hit a microsecond later. Titanic detonations turned the void into a boiling sea of fire that roiled and went out, taking down the last shield with it. The torpedoes came next, burning the dregs of their fuel hard to increase their kinetic impact. They slammed into the hull of the fortress. With melter arrays and chomping ranks of demon teeth, they chewed through layered ceramite and plasteel like maggots burrowing through the hides of livestock. Deep within, they ignited, sending plumes of fiery atmosphere gushing into the void. The behemoth Galatan remained untroubled by such a trifling injury, persisting in its assault, successively downing 2, 3, and then 5 lesser vessels of the primary fleet. All but one of the subjugated Imperial ships were decimated. Aflame along its sides, the last of the captured Imperial vessels cleaved through the breach in the shield arrays and collided forcefully with Galatan's compromised sector. Its decayed bow pierced the upper exterior, flinging aside spires and turret emplacements, tearing through the hull's surface as a divine plough through a field of iron. Explosions erupted upwards from the site of impact. Billowing gashes released clouds of gas in white spurts, expelling millions of cubic feet of atmosphere in an instant. The afflicted vessel trembled, leaving a trail of debris from the damage sustained. Its aft elevated, its ramming spear lodged in the starfort, nearly fracturing its backbone. Through the corridors of Galatan resonated the groans of tormented metal. Dorsal maneuvering thrusters ignited. Jets of startling purity burst from corroded apertures and nozzles, halting the ship's advance. Suspended over Galatan's starboard flank, its prow engaged in a lifeless embrace with the fabric of the station. From point-blank range, the operational cannons on its starboard side unleashed destruction, converting the scar on the space station into a luminous abyss. Following in its wake was a fleet of smaller vessels, ancient Dreadclaw assault pods boarding torpedoes of every dimension. Attack rams and Invader-class landing frigates surged past. The space surrounding Galatan turned into a lethal tapestry of light from anti-fighter volleys, yet the swarm of ships was overwhelming. The Terminus Est advanced alongside, reprising its venerable role as an assault vessel. Fire from a myriad of weapons clashed with its void shields, which blinked in nauseating hues upon their collapse. The fusillade struck the hull, shredding the flesh metal. Pus oozed into the vacuum. Flames enveloped its vile hull, yet it remained unstoppable. In the breach, the commandeered Imperial ship was swiftly reduced to wreckage. Repulsed by Gallatin's onslaught, it drifted aflame into the cosmos. Its crew forfeited. Its mission was accomplished. A breach was carved into Gallatin's sturdy hide, exposed to the void. The bifurcated bow of the Terminus Est unveiled its hangars. Hundreds of gunships surged forth through its immense maw. As abundant as flies in a swarm, the acolytes of Typhus, first captain of the Death Guard, swarmed onto Gallatin. Herald Nurgle wrought a terrible plague through the fortress's internal compartments. With a mere sweep of his hand, he obliterated Space Marines of the Grey Knights and Nova Marines. His pestilent flies gnawed at the defenders on the battlements. The presence of his blight corroded armaments, while the morale of the warriors plummeted. Bardan Davaro, Magister of the Nova Marines, dared to challenge him. That confrontation was devoid of words. The combatants simply assailed one another with unparalleled ferocity. Both were clad in Terminator armor, but Davaro donned the Indomitus model, while Typhus, as before, was encased in warp-altered cataphractii. Davaro attempted to overcome him with a series of lightning-fast attacks. With each strike, the two-handed power sword crackled with contained energy. Typhus retreated, spinning his scythe to parry the master's blows. Had Davaro been fighting anyone else, his sword would have long found a vulnerable spot. At a certain moment, the Herald of Nurgle was cornered, and victory seemed near, but Davaro made a mistake, costing him his life. Typhus's scythe soared upward with ruthless determination, splitting the Nova Marine's armor. Davaro halted abruptly, his body twitching from the strange sensor signals. The sword fell, and his hands reached for the scythe blade embedded in his chest cavity. From Typhus's white helm emanated a cough-like laugh, after which he yanked out the scythe. The blade exited the Loyalist's torso, breaking all ribs as its energy field annihilated anything it encountered. Davaro's remnants scattered across the floor. The chapter master perished in an instant. Another hero challenged Typhus. This brave soul was a librarian of the Grey Knights, his armor appearing as if forged from the purest silver. Winged figures on it radiated an unnatural light, and complex heraldic patterns adorned his shoulder plates. A nimbus of warp energy glowed around his head, while his massive halberd shimmered with overflowing power. He possessed psychic potential no less than Typhus himself. It was a battle of equals. Witnesses claimed the air filled with demonic screams and moans, marking the clash of two immaterial masters, each striving to incinerate the other's soul. At some point, the librarian plunged his blade into the traitor. Emitting an uncharacteristic scream for a death guard, Typhus staggered backward, while his opponent's glowing halberd made a large incision in his armor. A thin stream of blood flowed from the wound. The weapon produced an energy discharge, causing the traitor to reel. Typhus. The traveller was forced to retreat, and then the remnants of the Death Guard were expelled from Gallatin by arriving reinforcements from the surface. Months after the defeat, Mortarion summoned him to IAX, but Typhus declined again, stating he had visions sent by Grandfather himself, and he needed to return to the Scourge Stars with the 1st, 3rd, and 4th Plague Companies. According to the Herald, the Primarch was also to return, as it was the will of Nurgle. But Mortarion stayed to fight with Guilliman, and Typhus left his ranks. Scourge Stars came under attack, and the traitorous Fabius Bile managed to steal the Ark Corner Contagious, an artifact gifted to the Legion by the Great Unclean One named Rotigus. This artifact was filled with devastating pathogens, causing uncontrollable bodily regeneration. For the Death Guard, it was an unprecedented boon, as the spores from the depths of the Ark Corner Contagious allowed their wounds to heal faster than usual. However, for any other being, the effect of exposure to the unholy relic would be an accelerated, vile decomposition, capable of transforming a mighty warrior into a bloated pile of rotting flesh and swollen limbs, for abundance has always been the essence of the gifts of Rotigus. Fabius had preemptively prepared a chamber with an stasis field for this relic, and, having committed the theft, rushed to flee. Typhus. The traveller's fleet set out after him. When Fabius Bile united with the warband the Shriven, who bore the colours of the Black Legion, Typhus's fleet was already very close. Thus, Fabius persuaded the band's leader, Argento-Corion, to mobilize his forces. Typhus's squads left the Scourge Stars and found the spider with the help of captive demonic predators, which hissed and released bubbles as they approached the thief. The diseased fleet crawled out of the warp close to the planet Limaxis and bombarded the barge in orbit, from which distress signals emanated, and its explosion-pierced hull spilled fuel into the void. It was precisely on this ship that the thief was fleeing. Hence, suspecting a trap, Typhus ordered it to be shot down. He was not concerned about the preservation of the artifact, for physical impact could not harm a relic of immaterial origin. The ship suddenly came into motion, and its fall became controlled. Apparently there were survivors on board. The fleet secured its position in orbit, and Typhus sent part of the contingent to the surface to retrieve the Ark and capture the rotting head of Fabius. One after another, the desecrated ships plunged into the atmosphere of Limaxis, leaving behind toxic trails. When they landed, black clouds of flies burst forth from the opened hatches, followed by throngs of plague marines, clanking in heavy armor. Behind them emerged hordes of disfigured cultists and swollen demonic machines. Plague-burst crawlers paved paths through the fens and swamps with their heavy tracks, and leading with trusted officers, Typhus himself strode forward. Accompanied by his retinue of Terminators, he followed the energy signatures to where the recently bombarded ship had crashed. But instead of Fabius with the relic, they were met by a trap with a powerful bomb and throngs of half-mad clone slaves. The barge was obliterated by the explosion. Its fragments showered the entrenched plague marines with a deadly hail. But even before the echo of the explosion had fully died away, the Voxnet was ripped apart by screams from orbit. Someone had attacked the fleet. 4 black ships of the Shriven had stealthily approached them in the darkness of space and emerged amidst the unsuspecting plague fleet. The void immediately lit up with the fires of emitters and reflections of explosions on the hulls of the battle barges. Debris and lamentation filled the skies of Limaxis, and the moribund, the feculent gift, and the rancid blade were all heavily damaged. The surviving ships left their battle formations and rushed into the void to regroup and repel the attack. Meanwhile, onto the surface of the planet surged the barges of the Penitent, aboard which were Fabius, Argento-Corion, and their followers. Under the psychic shield of the Tirata, Fabius's forces launched an attack on the Death Guard. Typhus's soldiers snapped back with bolter volleys and the roar of heavy artillery, annihilating ranks of Tirata, as well as shooting down transporters and dreadclaws. These crashed somewhere in the swamps, forcing the Black Legionaries to make their way through the sucking mire to the required positions. When the enemies clashed in close combat, the roar of bolters and chainswords merged into a single cacophony of slaughter. Meanwhile, Fabius Bile watched his puppet in the form of Corion from a safe distance, sending wave after wave of Tirata. Under the pressure of the enemy, the Plague Marines regrouped several times, sending hordes of leprous cultists to assault. Huge shards of an exploded ship were used by them as barricades. Any other army would have preferred a panicked flight in such conditions, but the Death Guard here too showed perseverance and resilience. Their faith was rewarded when plagues of demon flies burst forth from the depths of the burning barge. Typhus and his Terminators returned to the battlefield. The Herald of Nurgle quickly gathered around himself an armoured fist of demon engines and began a counter-offensive against Bile's modified warriors. In the next moment, dozens of Tirata perished. As waves of mutants and clones broke against the wall of resolve of the Death Guard, Typhus contacted the fleet and learned that the ships had managed to seize the initiative. But instead of a slaughter over the fleet of the Shriven, he ordered support for the most damaged ships. The commanders accepted the order, and then the Rancid Blade and the Moribund attacked the surface of Limaxis. Soon, behind Fabius and his supporters, fortified outposts blazed, and he found himself squeezed between the strike zone of the Plague Fleet and the advancing units of Typhus. His position worsened when he learned that reinforcements of the Death Guard had landed in the north, southwest and southeast. Crowds of plague zombies poured out of the shuttles, encircling the Black Legion soldiers. The Spider realized that his trap had turned against him, and Corian sent a psychic signal to the north, from where 3 Thunderhawks flew out and attacked the approaching plague tank column from the north. Corian and Fabius, with a few surviving Tarata, rushed to the evacuation point, making their way knee-deep through the mud across crowds of groaning plague zombies, which kept dragging their soldiers into the swamp. The gnarled fingers of the dead squeezed the lenses of the helmets and then went for the eyeballs. Armor plates were torn off, and each warrior soon vanished into the swamp, full of walking corpses. With his psychic fire, Corian turned the unholy hordes to ash, and his Black Legionaries incinerated the enemy with flamethrowers. Nonetheless, they paid for every step with their lives. Finally, they reached the evacuation zone, where the Shriven had organized a defense and kept up a continuous fire at the zombies. When Bile found himself inside the shuttle, the launch command was given, and flames from the transport's nozzles scorched the advancing dead and the Space Marines who failed to escape in time. Typhus bitterly watched as the transports of the Shriven soared into the grey sky. Fabius avoided retribution and took the Ark Cornucontagious with him. But worst of all was the thought that he had fallen into the Spider's trap, and his forces had suffered immense damage. He summoned a sorcerer slave, and with his help reached out to the plague Captain Sputimus, who was in orbit around Limaxis. Initially he ordered the destruction of the fugitives from orbit, but soon learned it was impossible. Another ship of the Shriven, previously unnoticed, appeared in the void. The barge destroyed the frigate, the Moribund, which had already suffered significant damage, and was moving to a trans-atmospheric point to rendezvous with the evacuation transports. The thought that his forces could offer no resistance against the combined might of the Shriven filled Typhus with mounting rage. The destructive swarm's flies buzzed within him, and for a moment he considered ordering a continuation of the attack. However, he ordered a retreat. The captain understood that by preserving and augmenting the remaining forces, he would be able to successfully complete his hunt, and he was exceedingly skilled at pursuing a retreating enemy. He soon found the thief on the planet Dessa. On his way to this world, Typhus was not idle and attacked the systems he came across, gathering resources to repair damaged ships and replenishing his ranks with cultists and plague zombies. Fabius and his followers were also ready for the attack as soon as the plague fleet appeared in the system. However, Typhus came not only for the Ark Cornucontagious, but also for his revenge. The ships of the Shriven attempted to replicate the same maneuvers of sudden attack and thus activated night shields, which Bile had crafted for them based on xenotech from Comora. Typhus, however, was smarter. He had spread tracker entities across his fleet and given each of them the warp scent of the Shriven. Consequently, when the camouflaged ships attempted to attack the plague fleet, they discovered that the enemy's weapons were already aimed at them. The darkness of the void was stained with chains of explosions and gunfire, and the hulls of ships rained down onto Dessa in a deadly hail. Soon, the battle barge Drake Rampant attempted to attack Terminus Est, but could not withstand the assault and crashed onto the planet's surface. The rest of the Death Guard fleet opened their bomb bays and released a deadly arsenal onto the surface, damaging the void shields of the first bastion, after which Typhus's forces landed. Leading the assault were crowds of plague zombies, detonating themselves on booby traps. The explosions destroyed about 1,000 of the walking dead, but their numbers still remained vast. Following them were plague marines, escorting batteries of plague-burst crawlers, which fired at the fortress on the move, even as their tracks became mired in the remains of corpses. Mortars and heavy bolters fired at them from the walls. However, a significant breach soon formed in the wall of the first bastion, through which the walking dead seeped. Corpses piled upon each other, attempting to be the first to breach the gap, but all were swept away by the ferocious stream of Corian's psychic flame. Then the Tirata entered the fray, tearing them to pieces. Yet all this was merely a deceptive maneuver, for soon lightning tore through the air inside the bastion, and from the great rift emerged Typhus with a detachment of Terminators. Forewarned of the new threat, the Spider immediately ceased his work and issued an order to his assistants, who promptly began loading samples into biosarcophagi onto anti-grav transit racks to follow Fabius. Lastly, the scientist activated the final batch of altered warriors, and the creatures began to slowly awaken within their amniotic vats. In the midst of a fierce battle over Dessa, the Torchbearers' fleet loomed. Atal Tyvar, the shield captain, analyzed the situation and devised a plan according to which the fleet was to circumnavigate the planet from the shadow side and avoid a collision with the Death Guard's flotilla. In case of failure, they were doomed, for they were outnumbered and their ships were seriously damaged. The transports flew quite low over the plains and avoided detection, attacking the Death Guard's rear. The Custodes and the Sisters of Silence attacked demonic engines and hordes of the dead. Thus, new epicenters of battle formed beyond the bastion walls. In less than 10 minutes, Typhus's main armored force was destroyed, and the Loyalists advanced towards the breach in the wall. Their objective was entirely clear: to eliminate the sorcerer Argento Corian, known by the moniker the Enlightener. Above the bastion wall, transports hovered, down whose ramps descended 2 full squads of custodians led by Tyvar. They had recognized Fabius Bile during the battles on Bearston Prime and knew that the heretic must be eliminated before he could escape. Fabius completed his preparations and prepared to leave the laboratory, while his servants began to slowly disable the reactor that powered the entire complex. Their actions triggered a gradual destruction of the core. Fabius had no intention of leaving anyone alive. Whoever won the battle for Dessa would also find their burial there. However, the overconfident surgeon underestimated Typhus the Traveller, who had already traversed the complex like a roaring armoured train, catching up to Fabius by breaking through partitions, walls, and slicing through encountered Tirata with his battle scythe. The champion of Nurgle and his Blightlord Terminators blocked the path to the evacuation transport, and Fabius was forced to fight a battle from which he could not emerge victorious under any circumstances. Nevertheless, luck was on his side. The suddenly appearing Tyvar demanded the release of the captured custodians and the Sisters of Silence, to which the Spider suggested he search for them himself, as the captives were still somewhere within the fortress. Completely losing patience, Typhus crushed several biosarcophagi and released a devastating swarm that devoured Fabius's servants and cut him off from the Golden Warriors. At that moment, hand flamers ignited, and the Custodian's Terminators clashed with the attacking Blightlord. The Spider hid from the crossfire, cursing his obsession with work. He raised the Zyclos Needler and fired, taking down several Terminators, but received a volley from bolters in response. The surgeon instantly clicked into action, healing his wounds. Eventually, he despaired completely, throwing away all his research materials and valuable samples before fleeing. Typhus charged after him through the torrential fire of the troops. The wounded Fabius activated a force field to shield himself from the devastating swarm and leaped over the lift barrier, which closed right in front of the traveller. Typhus was left with the attacking custodians and realized he could not win this battle. He uttered a spell, and he was enveloped by a cloud of plague flies. When the swarm dispersed, Typhus had vanished, leaving the surviving Terminators to fight to the last. The battle on Dessa raged for some time, while the leaderless, the Shriven, depleted their strength. Among the ranks of the Death Guard, the word spread about the return of their commander to the fleet, and they gradually withdrew their forces. Their quarry had escaped again, and the artifact was not recovered. Filled with bitterness and contempt, they left the battlefield. As for Fabius himself, he was never seen on Dessa again. Rumors have it that a light frigate slipped through the cluster of orbital debris and the dying crossfire of orbital warfare and disappeared into the void. Since then, Typhus. The Traveller has not been seen in any battle. The loss of the Ark Cornicontagious served as an important lesson for him. On Limaxis, he realized he had been too arrogant, too impulsive, and too eager to shame his genetic father. He should have foreseen the trap set by Fabius and avoided his defeat. Perhaps now he sits on his throne aboard the Terminus Est, searching for traces of Fabius in the streams of the Immaterium. Or maybe he brings disease and curse to another segmentum of the Imperial space. In any case, he remains a faithful servant of Grandfather Nurgle, for there is no other truth among the stars than his eternal grace.